And the first one is from an author by the name of Franz Fanon, who wrote the book, Wretched of the Earth, written in the 1960s. He said once that we revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. And Malcolm X said one time, you can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he or she has their freedom. And the revolutionary artist Nina Simone was asked by a reporter in an interview. He asked her, what does freedom mean to you? And without any hesitation or pause, Nina Simone looked at the interviewer and said, it means to live without fear. And I go for that to say that this year marks a very important anniversaries. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the birth of the Black Panther Party, founded in October 1966 in California. But there's also another important anniversary of the March Against Fear, June 1st, 1966. It was a march between Memphis, Tennessee, and Jackson, Mississippi. It was led by a gentleman by the name of James Meredith. And some of you, hopefully in your history books, know James Meredith because he helped to desegregate the University of Mississippi in 1962, becoming the first African American to be enrolled in the University of Mississippi. In most cases of the civil rights movement, most people would not march by themselves. Usually it was a no-no to march or organize by yourself. But James decided to march by himself, going from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. And on the second day of his march, he was shot by a racist on the highway. And it was decided by a number of the leading activists and organizations in the civil rights movement, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael. Organizations like the Urban League, and of course, the most famous of them all, and in fact the oldest civil rights organization in the country, the NAACP. Also the organization CORE, which had led the freedom marches and freedom rides in the early 1960s. The March Against Fear was continued on by these organizations. But what happened on that highway throughout the month of June, from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi, was a great debate would develop, literally on the highway. If you watch the documentary Eyes on the Prize, you can see a debate between Dr. King and Stokely Carmichael. And they were debating actually the tactics and the strategy to take the movement forward. Dr. King, probably one of the most famous revolutionaries of the 20th century, and Stokely Carmichael, someone that in many ways people would say was the next incarnation of Malcolm X. They would debate the question about reform or liberalism, that the government in fact should be able to provide resources for working class people and the poor, and particularly for African Americans who are fighting on the questions of civil rights and voting rights. They were debating in fact the question of the Vietnam War and the questions of the Lyndon B. Johnson administration when the United States was escalating the war in Vietnam against the communist threat. There were great debates about black nationalism and that white people should not even be part of the civil rights movement. That was a very important debate, an important discussion, because in many ways, and I will get to this in a moment, it has a rippling effect for us today when we think of the Black Lives Matter movement and banner. But that march also was instructive for Dr. King, because unfortunately in the United States, Dr. King is freeze-framed for the March on Washington and I Have a Dream August 1963 speech. But what most people don't talk about is the Dr. King of 1966, the Dr. King of 1967, and the Dr. King of 1968. Because after the Meredith March, the March Against Fear, Dr. King would go to Chicago, Illinois, and live in Chicago, and live under what we know as Jim Crow South. But in the United States, at that particular moment in time, there was Jim Crow America, because you had deep poverty in the urban cities like New York, in the urban cities like Chicago. And so Dr. King, along with his 4 kids and wife, lived in Chicago, living under the threat of deep poverty and housing discrimination and inequality. Dr. King would give his speech against the Vietnam War in 1967, April 4th, 1967. He became one of the most articulate representatives against the war in Vietnam. And he opposed the war in Vietnam because he used to sit down at the television station, And if you can imagine this, remember, there's no Twitter and there's no Facebook in the 1960s. So television was a new phenomenon in many ways. And Dr. King saw the body bags of young people. Many of you actually would be the age of those who would be drafted into the war, 17, 18, 19 years old. That money was being diverted from the Great Society under Lyndon B. Johnson and the great anti-poverty programs. And all the money was being diverted into the war effort. And so Dr. King saw this taking place. And he began to speak out all around the country. And he linked the question of civil rights to the question of war and militarism and poverty. And in 1968, we know what takes place. He is down in Memphis, Tennessee, organizing with sanitation workers who are fighting against poverty wages and despicable conditions on the job. He is gunned down April 4, 1968, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. But since Dr. King's death, now close to over 48 years ago, we have lived through a profound moment in America. Yes, there has been a change of social attitudes because of the social movements and the power of the working class and poor to break down the walls of segregation in the United States. Social attitudes have changed because if you can think about this, you would not have the first African-American president in the United States. But we have had a rise of what I like to call, maybe we can get into this in the Q&A, of a black misleadership class. Those who have taken the advantages of the Civil Rights Movement, of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, who have reaped profound benefits from the great struggles. But what we have are leaders that are more about their own profits and their own status instead of the conditions that exist among the black, urban, working class, and underclass in the United States. And I will explain about that in a moment. That the U.S. government at the same time had unleashed a brutal military assault called the Counterintelligence Program that sought to destroy all of the social movements, its organizations, and its leading activists. Organizations like the Black Panther Party, organizations like Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Council. Anyone that spoke out against the war was a target. We have also many people begin to be part of the Democratic Party as a political formation. And then something happens in the mid-1970s. There was an economic crisis in the United States and around the world. In 1974-75, the world literally was turned upside down. And what we would have ushered in the United States and around the world what we know today, and hopefully you guys are reading it, who are supporters of Bernie Sanders, would know of neoliberal capitalism. And what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is the reduction of regulations on corporations, a weakening of unions and reducing wages, the cutting of public spending on social programs and infrastructure, the privatizing of public services, and cutting taxes for the rich and the multinational corporations. Neoliberal capitalism has had a profound effect on the U.S. working class and poor, but particularly for people of color, who in this nation historically have always had a disadvantage in the sense of wealth, in the sense of prosperity and status in the United States. Let's look at this. Let's unpackage neoliberal capitalism a little bit and how it has affected working people, the poor, but particularly people of color, and black workers and youth. Oxfam stated this: the wealth of the poorest half of the world's population, more than 3.6 billion people, has fallen by $8 trillion. That's 41% since 2010. Meanwhile, the wealth of the richest 62 people, and think about this, 62 people who probably fill up a bus, has increased their wealth by more than $500 billion to stand at $1.76 trillion. In contrast, at the time of the economic collapse of 07-08, and I don't know if you guys remember the economic collapse of the housing bubble bursting in the air, that people of color in the United States had lost between 71 and $92 billion of wealth. Now, let me make it clear to you that wealth is not what you have in your bank account. Wealth is what you have in assets. Wealth is what you own in houses and land and property. That is the largest loss of wealth in U.S. history. At the same time, the United States ruling elite, and because of Occupy Wall Street, they're known as the 1%. But I would like to say it's the 0.01%, the even smaller elite of people that have unimaginable wealth and power in the United States. In fact, they've hoarded close to $3 trillion of wealth in offshore accounts in other parts of the world. And think about infrastructure for a moment. I know many of you have read about Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis. Or think about Detroit, Michigan. I'll come back to that in a moment. So we've seen the massive accumulation of wealth and power in so few hands. Let me give you some more statistics. Don't you know that 7.1 million children in the United States, and the United States is the richest nation in human history, they live in the deepest levels of poverty and inequality. 67% of the new jobs created since the economic crisis of 07-08 have been low-wage jobs. Before the economic crisis, if you went to get a job, the average wage for a good-paying job would be between $13 and $21 an hour. Today it stands at $7 to $13 an hour. In many ways, sisters and brothers, we live in low-wage America. And we live in an America that is two Americas. One for Wall Street and the super wealthy, and one for the poor and the working class that are struggling every single day to survive. But what is the state of Black America? And let me give a few points about this. From 1990 to 2000, the percentage of poor Black individuals and families living in neighborhoods where the poverty rate was 40% or higher fell by 30% to 19%. Now, in this period, this is the years of the Bill Clinton administration. administration. Many of you maybe just was being born at that time. But those, if you read through the history books, they would say that that was the most prosperous time of the U.S. economy. The rise of globalization, the rise of neoliberal capitalism. But since 2000, however, this favorable trend sharply reversed, and the post-2009 economic recovery has not improved matters. By 2014, according to the most recent data from the Annie E. Cassie Foundation, 32% of black children were living in neighborhoods where the poverty rate was 30% or more. A higher percentage of black children live in impoverished neighborhoods than in any other demographic group, including American Indians who live on reservations, and they're only 2% of the U.S. population, who lie just below at 31%, Hispanics at 24%, Asian Americans at 8%, and non-Hispanic whites at 5%. We're also looking at numbers like African Americans at 52.5% live in communities where poverty levels exceeds 20%. And we can put it another way. 44.8% of all non-poor African Americans live in neighborhoods where the poverty rate exceeds 20%. In contrast, 8.1% of whites live in such neighborhoods. I say that to say that will give you an impression, since the economic crisis, that African Americans are struggling just to stay afloat in America and prosperous in America. But something else is going on too that is not reported in the news. And that is the deep levels of poverty among the white working class and white poor, to which is not talked about too often. And in some ways, I want to highlight this point because racism is a very insidious system of thought. It's institutionalized. This idea of the separation between black and white, between immigrant and U.S. born citizens. And it's set up that way so that you and I can fight together on the key issues that matter to us, like housing and jobs and education and healthcare in many ways. But also, because of the deep levels of poverty and inequality in society, the U.S. ruling elite has also set up a very insidious system of confinement and imprisonment, and what Michelle Alexander has stated as the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration. Let's look at this for a moment. 5% of the United States has 5% of the world's population, but the United States houses 25% of the world's prisoners. We have 6 million people under correctional supervision, meaning either jail, prison, probation, parole. But that has not included 300,000 immigrants, quote-unquote illegal immigrants, who are housed in correctional facilities in the United States and then deported. And I have to say this, unfortunately, that President Obama has been the leading president on the question of mass deportations of immigrants in the United States. We have more black and brown bodies in the dungeons of American capitalism than we had in slavery in 1850. Half of the 2.3 million prisoners are black and brown youth and working people who have been ensnared in the war on drugs. But in fact, it's not been a war on drugs, it's been a war on our youth and the poor. The fastest growing population in prison are women. Many who are single mothers, many who are just trying to find a way forward for themselves and their families. I mentioned Michigan, and what is taking place in Michigan, what I like to call austerity state. Because we've seen a destruction of not just the living standards, but also the infrastructure of Flint, which historically was a predominantly black enclave, a black working class. And if we think about Detroit, and Flint, and the state of Michigan, Historically, Michigan was where the auto industry, the citadel of American entrepreneurship and capitalism. At its height in 1950, Michigan, or Detroit, had 2 million people who lived in the city. Today it stands at under 700,000 people living in Detroit, with most of the public space and public property and its educational system, and this should be something that you should think about. Its educational system, its public schools have been totally eviscerated, destroyed, as they're selling off the property of Detroit because of purely not just poor mismanagement, but because they put profits over people in Flint and in Detroit. And the water crisis, you think about this, the world is 90% made of water. But people cannot find drinkable water in one of the most richest nations in human history. And then, of course, you have places like Chicago, with the epitome of the Wall Street mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who has unleashed a regressive policy of major budget cuts. And we know about the case of Laquan McDonald, the young man who was gunned down in Chicago just a few months ago. At the same time, President Obama had cut $8 billion from welfare. I want to use another Malcolm X quote because I think this one touches on the point that I'm trying to make. Malcolm X said that they cripple the bird's wings and then condemn it for not flying as high as they. What is the role of the police and law enforcement? For certain communities, they are there to serve and protect. And in many ways, because of the kind of condition that exists, there are questions of crime, of course. And when there's poverty, there's crime and violence, because people are trying to find a way forward. And sometimes they do get involved into illegal activities. But there are certain communities that are policed differently than other communities. So the role of the police and law enforcement, as it was during slavery and slave patrols, at the core of law enforcement, it's about maintaining the power and the prestige of the ruling elite. Think about this for one moment. Not one chief executive officer of a Wall Street firm or bank has ever been arrested for probably the greatest crime against humanity, the collapse of the economy in 07-08. But you have Laquan and Letitia on the streets of Harlem or Brooklyn, or even here from Newark, Patterson, New Jersey, or East Orange, being arrested and thrown in prison. Not one CEO ever indicted or convicted for their lies and their deceit on Wall Street as people thought they were investing, only to find out that their money was being basically speculated and used like casino chips at Atlantic City, but it's just Wall Street. The rise of the BLM movement, or banner, and I've had the pleasure to go to Ferguson 3 times and to sit and organize with the young people who are protesting for over 100 days after the death of Michael Brown. And I want you to have the image in your head. This is very important, because Michael Brown was basically your age, 17, 18 years old. He was about to go to college. He was gunned down, and his body laid in the hot sun for 4 hours. The police didn't allow his mama to come and to see his body. And I want to take you back to 1955. A young 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was sent down to Mississippi to stay with his family for summer vacation. And he was accused of whistling at a white woman. And that white woman went to her husband and his friend and said that this little, excuse my language, but that little nigger whistled at me. You gotta remember that we live in Jim Crow America, so there were certain habits, socially and economically and politically, that you had to do in order to keep yourself safe in the South and even in the North. And so they went to the boy's house and they said they want the boy. And they drug the boy out of his family's home and they put a bullet in his head and dropped him in the nearby river. And his mom, Mamie Till Mobley, went to recover the body and brought the body back to Chicago for the burial. And she made the heart-wrenching decision to keep the casket open so the world can see what racism had done to her child. And I want to connect Emmett Till's death in August of 1955 to the death of Michael Brown in August 2014. Because the BLM movement, the same way as Emmett Till was an inspiration to the civil rights movement, 3 months before Rosa Parks sat down on a segregated bus, December 1st, 1955, it was the death of Emmett Till that inspired a new generation. It was Michael Brown's death that inspired the BLM movement in the Ferguson Rebellion. And then Freddie Gray in Baltimore, a place that was an austerity city, that when we think about it, had lost thousands of homes because of the economic crisis. Freddie Gray, unfortunately running from the police, was thrown in the back of a police van, and they call it a rough ride. And so he was thrown from left to right in the van, severing his neck. And the reason why the youth in Baltimore rebelled was the simple fact that Freddie Gray was their contemporary. He was just like them. And so when we think of Ferguson and Baltimore, when we think of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's a life-affirming banner that says that our lives matter. Our lives matter because we can't find jobs, that we're ensnared in the mass incarceration system, that imprisons us, that we go to school to try to get an education, but we don't have enough books in the classroom for ourselves to even share with our fellow students. When I walk the streets of Brooklyn or Harlem, that I can be swept up by the police or stopped and frisked for no apparent reason, because I'm walking black or walking brown. In many ways, we're living in lower and order America. No matter how they project it around the world, when we get down to it, we're living in a society where there's two Americas. One for Wall Street and one for the rest of us. Don't you know that in 1990, both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, signed a bill that allowed military weaponry to be brought back from overseas wars and activities to be used in our urban centers. You can have a police department like in Ferguson, which is a suburb actually of St. Louis, mainly black. And they could have a Humvee. Now in Ferguson, why would you need a Humvee in a small police department? Or in New York, for example. New York, New York City, if it was its own country, New York City, would be the third largest military force in the world. We have 35,000 police officers in New York City. The BLM movement is developing. It's a new movement and has its challenges. It is fighting against the idea of law enforcement terrorism. But it's spread to different universities and campuses around the country. I don't know if you guys remember the Missouri football players on the campus of Missouri that decided that if the president and the chancellor of the school didn't step down because of the racism on the campus, that they were not going to participate in any practices, they were not going to play in any football games. And so 30 black football players, along with their coach and other students who stood in solidarity. That's the power when people are united together. Stood together, and they decided that we will fight against the racism on the campus of Missouri. And Missouri, University of Missouri, is only about 20 miles away from Ferguson, actually. That act alone forced the president and the chancellor to step down late last year. That's a powerful moment and movement victory for the Black Lives Matter movement. But we've seen new organizations born in over 100 campuses of black student unions, not just taking on the issues of racism, but the question of student debt. And hopefully you guys who are going off to college soon don't have to worry about student debt. But I'm sad to tell you that student debt stands at $1.3 trillion. It is higher than personal debt. And unfortunately, the question of free education, as Bernie Sanders says, is correct. Will go a long way in providing an education for everyone, actually, who wants it. The question of fighting against tuition hikes, or stopping cuts to vital programs, or even the big question that faces all of us, environmental destruction. As we saw just this past couple of days, 7 states in the Midwest hit by powerful tornadoes, destroying homes, power that we've never seen in the most recent memory. Also, people fighting for better wages, a higher minimum wage. Here in New Jersey, there's a campaign to raise the minimum wage for low-wage workers, the Fight for 15, which my dear friend Megan is involved in, actually. Black Lives Matter is still at a very important stage of its development. It's different from state to state, and it's different from city to city. So we have to have some patience with the movement. It has its questions and it has its problems. The Democratic Party is heavily involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I say that because I don't support either political party. I'm an independent. But historically, the Democratic Party has played the role as a brake on social movements, the social struggle of working people and the poor. They want to co-opt the movement into the Democratic Party. And I'm sure I'm going to get a question about the Democrats, I'm sure. Also, you have organizations like non-governmental organizations like NGOs, who unfortunately play a very insidious role. Mainly, they're not about really being independent truly. It's about getting money from large foundations, organizations. And so whoever controls the purse strings of any organization controls the message of that organization. But we've had a lack of victories. As powerful as the Black Lives Matter movement has been, I want to let you know that there's only a 3% ratio on a national average of cops who are indicted by the state for killing unarmed civilians. 3%. And I don't know how many of you followed the case of Peter Lang. Peter Lang, who was indicted and convicted of killing Ike Early in a Brooklyn project. But the judge decided not to give him the maximum, but to give him 800 hours of community service and probation. Imagine if that was me and I did that, how much time I would get actually in prison. I want to end on 2 points and get to your questions. I really want to hear from you. That for the Black Lives Matter movement to really grow and to develop, it will have to take on bigger issues than just law enforcement violence. It would have to talk about the infrastructure of the United States, like in Flint or in Detroit, Michigan. It would have to have democratic structures where there's democratic discussion and debate about where the movement is and where it's going and its program. It has to include organizations like the labor movement and civic organizations and religious organizations. It has to encompass the conditions of all working people, and I mean in particular, white working people, white poor. There's this thing that's going to, I'm sure you guys have heard, where people say all lives matter. And in some ways, from my perspective, that's used to cut across the slogan, the demand of Black Lives Matter. But I'm a socialist, and I believe that all working class lives matter. But I do say that Black lives do matter because of the disproportionate level of violence and inequality that we have in this nation. The Black Lives Matter movement has to have demands that talk about education for all, nationalized health care, jobs, restoring the budget cuts so we can provide social public services for working people, and really build a profound, sustaining movement that can last a lifetime. But we have another threat, and it's a very scary threat, I must say, and that is the rise of right-wing populism. And we know who is the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party. You know him from his reality TV show, right? With the catchphrase, "You're fired." Keep that in mind, that catchphrase, "You're fired." Right? I guess that's the ethos of American capitalism. The rise of Donald Trump and the forces of reaction against Muslims, against women, and a heavy dosage of sexism and misogyny, the questions of anti-immigrant sentiment. Trump is scary, but the people around him, and I want to make a very clear distinction, these are working people who have been marginalized, who have been devastated by the economic crisis. Many of them have lost their jobs, have lost their homes, have lost their farms, have lost their pension plans, and they're looking for answers. And so Trump speaks to them in a very popular way. He rails against Wall Street, despite he's a billionaire. He talks about the things in some ways in a very simplistic way. So in some ways, our movement has to talk to the Trump supporters, because they're not idiots and they're not ignorant. There are racist elements, there are sexist elements inside of them. And so we must be able to discuss with them. Because I think if we can discuss with them about the key issues that affect them, like health care and jobs and education, I think we can create a pathway of discussion and a way forward. But we're seeing a polarization of the entire system, of the entire establishment. Both political parties are in crisis, Republicans and Democrats. So I want to end on this note. My precious sisters and brothers, your generation is faced with a mind-numbing dilemma. You have the questions of environmental destruction. You have the rise of sexist and misogynist ideas in this country. You have the reality of law enforcement terror. And you have global economic instability. In my opinion, capitalism and racism is a malignant cancer on the heart, on the body and minds of the 99% of the working class and poor of this country and around the world. I am of the opinion that the struggle for internationalism, socialism, and true democracy based on the 99%. You and I, the students of this esteemed high school, making the decisions about what you should learn, how should we be civically involved, socially engaged, and politically aware. I believe that's the trueness of democracy, where we decide and not a small minority in this country and world. I believe it is the only way for you and I to finally uproot the seeds of the edifice of capitalism and racial oppression of this very crumbling empire. But my hope is, as it was during the Civil Rights Movement, that we're not going to let anyone turn us around, that we will continue to fight, because this fight is not about just you and I, but it's about the generation and future generations. I thank you so much. Let's talk.